Let's talk about how to make the shards obsolete. So, in my last video, which I acknowledge it's been a while, I'll link it here, I talked about the story of Darethil and the Wandersail. And what I argued is that the story of Darethil and the Wandersail is a way for Wit to teach Kaladin a map on how to rediscover the original parts of Roshar that Adonalsium had created and that have been lying dormant or hidden since like thousands of years. For today's video, I want to dial it out and I want to talk about what that original Roshar was, what led it to falter, and how, if Kaladin actually succeeds in his quest to find Adonalsium's origin of Roshar, how it would make the shards entirely irrelevant. So let's get into Roshar's past, present, and future. And if it isn't obvious already, this video will include spoilers for all of the Stormlight Archive up until the end of Wind and Truth. I'll also briefly reference Isles of the Emberdark, but I'm not spoiling anything. So with that, let's get into it. Let's start with the past. What was Roshar supposed to be? What is Roshar's creation and its origin? Roshar was created about 12 to 13,000 years before the events of the Stormlight Archive. And we know this because most of what we know about that original Roshar is from Honor, who sees kind of the only glimpse that we have of that kind of like untouched Roshar. Honor says, I, God, found a world unmanaged, blue against a black sky, a globe of infinite potential. This was a new creation, I sensed, one of Adonalsium's most recent masterworks. It sang to me its name through tones and rhythm. And then he goes on to say, here in this world, I found perfection, a relic of the being I had slain for his own good. Roshar had been grown entirely from equations as a grand testament to the divine nature of mathematics, a celebration of the intimate relationship between song, numbers, and art. What this tells us is that Roshar was special. It was created by Adonalsium, the closest to like a one god that the Cosmere has. It was one of that one god or Adonalsium's masterworks, and it was given special attention by him. And because it happened so close to his demise, so close to his eventual shattering about 1,000 years later, it was potentially even created with his foreknowledge of his eventual demise. And what does Honor do when he finds Roshar? He immediately changes it. He says, I invested this land restoring godhood. And he has an inkling when he does that maybe he acted a little rashly, like maybe he did something without actually realizing the consequences, because he says, for a moment I doubted. Did I understand what I had done? Did I regret? But Honor, which I think is one of his biggest flaws, does not give a second thought about this doubt, because at that moment, Cultivation, his lover, arrives on the planet and they just move on from thinking about the consequences. And I think this action from Honor, more than even his role in the shattering of Adonalsium on a different planet known as Yolen, is where Roshar really truly begins to drift away from Adonalsium's vision. By investing the land, Honor changes it fundamentally. He alters its kind of underlying system in a way that Roshar never really fully has recovered from. And coupled with his continued interference, the interference or involvement of Cultivation, and then, of course, Odium's arrival to the planet, really does change the planet. But there are elements of that pre-Shardic or Adonalsium's Roshar that do survive and that lay dormant or hidden for thousands of years. And we're only now in the Stormlight Archive beginning to figure out what those are. Honor says this, actually. He says, there were echoes, of course, of my predecessor, little bits of him left behind. 3 powerful incarnations who had his voice, and many smaller ones representing aspects of nature and personality. As we learn in Wind and Truth, those 3 powerful incarnations are almost certainly referring to the 3 original Spren of Roshar. That's the wind, the stone, and the night. And 2 of them we meet directly. The wind, who we see in Wind and Truth and who appears to and speaks to and guides Kaladin. And then the stones who appear to speak to and guide Venli. We don't meet the knight, but the point here is that these three spren, the wind and the stone at least, they're not Honor's creations, they're Adonalsium's creation, and they don't speak in commands. They don't demand oaths, for example. Instead, they guide through melody and resonance. And resonance is a theme that I'll keep coming back to because that, I think, is the foundation of Adonalsium's Roshar. It isn't just those three spren that are products of Adonalsium's original Roshar. It's also the listeners. Honor says, beyond these tiny spirits, Roshar had people, a curious variety who could hear the songs of gods. That orderliness sang to my soul and to the power I now held. Those are some of the earliest listeners, singers, whatever we want to call them, that represent kind of Adonalsium's true vision of Roshar. In fact, they retain fragments of the earliest rhythms from when Adonalsium reigned over Roshar, and even though much of those rhythms have gotten lost over the years, they still persist. In fact, El, who we meet in one of Dalinar's flashbacks in Wind and Truth, alludes to this. He tells Jezrien, he says, there is a darkness growing in this land, new gods, Jezrien, and the old ones are losing their voices. And then he goes on to say, but I listen to the old gods, meaning the wind and the stone. What that old Roshar is music. It's music and math and art operating together in a resonance system. And that music is what we begin to rediscover in Rhythm of War through Wind and Truth. The most notable example here is Venli. In Wind and Truth, Venli hears the chasm fiends start singing, and she feels the notes that the chasm fiends are singing vibrating within her gem heart. And she realizes there were tones to the planet, she realizes, separate from the rhythms that her people heard. Perhaps these were the tones of the gods. And those tones lead Venli and then lead Venli to lead her people towards one location on Roshar, which I think is where Adonalsium's Roshar is hidden, and that is the Shattered Plains. Because as the Chasm Fiends sing the original notes of Roshar, the stones urge Venli to shape the sand in front of her and help it kind of coax it to respond to the music. And as it does, the sand forms geometric patterns in response to those tones that form exactly the shape of the Shattered Plains. The Chasm Fiends, through their music, lead Venli to a place where, as she describes, the songs are loudest. A song, 1,000 powerful songs sung by fragments of light in the ground on the Shattered Plains, hidden within the Shattered Plains, which is also, by the way, where Odium's perpendicularity is hidden. And like Venli, I think with teaching Kaladin one of those original songs of Roshar will lead him to the Shattered Plains. And what's important here is that, again, like Venli, Kaladin will be able to hear that music and align himself with that original part of Roshar. And I just want to say, this is why we can contextualize, or this is how we can contextualize Navani's discoveries in Rhythm of War, which I feel like when I read Rhythm of War, it felt like a really long, tome about kind of these various scientific discoveries, and I didn't really understand why it was important. But I think with hindsight, we can appreciate it a little bit more. Because as Navani is on the cusp of discovering anti-void light, she feels and appreciates this interconnection between music and math, which is what Adonalsium created Roshar to be. And she resolves that humans, she says, could sing the correct tones. Humans could hear the music of Roshar. Her ancestors might have been alien to this world, but she was its child. And what that shows us is that even though humans arrived to Roshar later, Kaladin and humans can hear the music of Roshar. They can become part of Adonalsium's Roshar. But frankly, I feel like at this point, all of this could just sound symbolic, like aligning the humans and resonance. But it really isn't because there's really like very real power, meaningful power hidden here that I think essentially makes the shards look like amateurs in comparison. Rhythms are what enable navigation in the Cosmere. They function like currents. It's how dusk navigates in the Cosmere or in Shadesmar and Isles of the Emberdark, and it's certainly how the humans escaped Ashen, their burning planet, to find Roshar and find refuge. Rhythms also generate physical structures. We see a nascent version of that when Venli is shaping the sand, but they generate physical structure through cymatic patterns. They can help stones move as if they're liquid. We can imagine massive structures being shaped through attunement rather than through investiture. And on Roshar, they underpin biology itself, from the forms of the singers to chasm fiend pupation. In fact, it explains why the chasm fiends need to travel to the shattered plains in order to pupate, because that's where the songs are the strongest. And so there's no reason to think that they couldn't also enable humans to access new forms that are outside investiture and entirely separate from radiant oaths. Once you put all of that together, this ability to navigate, this ability to create structure, this ability to maybe have new forms, the implication to me is like pretty profound because it makes the shardic power and investiture obsolete, or at least like one of the many powers that you might be able to access. You don't need a shard in imposing intent upon a world. The planet can help you do that if you listen. We think about kind of Adonalsium's vision, especially Adonalsium that might have foreseen his own demise. It's really profound because shards operate through will and intent imposed from outside, whereas rhythms and kind of the system that Adonalsium created is more reciprocal. It requires attunement and balance and the planet and individuals to be kind of responding to each other. So if Adonalsium foresaw his own end, which he very well could have, Roshar might have been his ability to create a self-balancing system showing a radically different approach to what the Cosmere could look like. And Kaladin, as someone who is becoming increasingly someone who listens more than he commands, may be uniquely positioned to restore that. So yeah, what do you think? This is, I hope you check out my first video about Darethil and Wandersail, which kind of breaks down the story itself of Darethil and the Wandersail. But to me, this is where Roshar's past, present, and future is leading, is one that comes back to its original vision that is not about the shards and that is about resonance and balance, and I think could be a really profound way to reshape kind of what the forces in the Cosmere look like. So let me know what you think. My next video that I want to do is actually about how I think this will lead to the most epic mashup of two characters that have yet to meet and will create like this such a fun butt-kicking duo. So stay tuned. And if you like this kind of content, please like and please subscribe. You can also become a member of this channel and like task me to do certain video topics. And so with that, thanks everyone.